In southern Russia, hidden in the shadow of the Ural Mountains, lies a lake so toxic that to simply stand on its shore for 1 hour would be enough to kill you. This is Lake Karachay, once a quiet, unremarkable body of water, now ranked among the most contaminated places on Earth. At its peak, radiation levels on the lake's banks reached more than 600 roentgens per hour. To put that in perspective, just 500 roentgens absorbed in a short time is considered a lethal dose for humans. No nuclear explosion, no mushroom cloud, just still water, shimmering under the sun, silently lethal. It is one of the deadliest legacies of the Cold War, and its story reveals how human ambition, secrecy, and neglect turned a lake into a nuclear grave. The origins of Lake Karachay's deadly transformation lie in the aftermath of World War II. In 1945, as the United States demonstrated its atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union scrambled to catch up. The result was the creation of a top-secret facility called the Mayak Production Association near the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, today known as Ozersk. By 1949, Mayak had produced enough plutonium for the USSR's first nuclear weapon, but the process created something else: vast amounts of high-level radioactive waste. Instead of developing long-term storage solutions, Soviet planners prioritized speed and secrecy. Waste was first dumped into the nearby Teka River, contaminating thousands of villagers downstream. When the river could no longer be used, attention shifted to Lake Karachay, a small and isolated basin just a few kilometers away. The logic was chilling. A closed lake would keep the problem hidden. What entered its waters would never escape into the wider world. At least that's what the Soviet government believed. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Mayak expanded rapidly, producing tons of plutonium for the Soviet arsenal. Every stage of production created more waste, and truckloads of it were poured into Lake Karachay. By the mid-1960s, thousands of tons of radioactive material had settled into the lake's sediments. Cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium, isotopes with half-lives stretching from decades to thousands of years, sank into the waterbed. Meanwhile, the Soviet nuclear program flourished. By the 1960s, the USSR had achieved nuclear parity with the United States, boasting thousands of warheads. But this triumph came at an invisible cost. Residents of nearby villages reported mysterious illnesses, birth defects, and cancers. Studies later revealed that by the late 1950s, nearly 30,000 people along the Techa River had been exposed to dangerous radiation levels. Yet inside the walls of Chelyabinsk 40, this was considered acceptable collateral. Lake Karachay remained hidden from the world, a silent reservoir of nuclear ambition. The first major warning came not from the lake itself, but from the Mayak facility. In September 1957, a massive explosion tore through one of Mayak's underground waste storage tanks. Known today as the Kishtim disaster, it released 20 million curies of radioactive material into the environment, second only to Chernobyl in scale. Tens of thousands of people were exposed. Hundreds of villages were evacuated, but the event was kept secret by Soviet authorities for decades. Lake Karachay, still absorbing waste during this time, became even more central to the crisis. Then came 1967, the year Lake Karachay could no longer hide its poison. A severe drought shrank the lake, exposing radioactive sediments along its drying banks. Wind swept across the exposed lake bed, carrying radioactive dust for miles. By some estimates, over 400,000 people were affected by this airborne contamination, in what became known as the Karachay Incident. Entire regions reported rising cancer rates and genetic mutations. Soviet scientists privately recorded the event as one of the largest unintentional radiation releases in history. Publicly, the disaster barely existed. By the 1970s, the numbers surrounding Lake Karachay were staggering. Standing on its shore for just 60 minutes without protection meant absorbing a lethal dose of radiation. Tests revealed levels exceeding 600 roentgens per hour. For comparison, workers at nuclear power plants are limited to 5 roentgens per year under safety guidelines. To ordinary Russians, the lake was invisible, off limits, hidden behind fences and guards. To scientists, it became a macabre benchmark of contamination. Lake Karachay wasn't just polluted, it was transformed into a nuclear time bomb. Its sediments storing enough radioactive material to poison millions if ever released. By the late Soviet era, Lake Karachay was no longer just a dumping site. It had become an active threat to the region. Every drought, every shift in water levels risked exposing contaminated mud to the air. The very environment around it was permanently altered. Birds avoided it. Fish could not live in it. Even standing nearby meant danger. Local populations bore the brunt. Reports from the 1970s and 1980s show rising cancers, thyroid disorders, and birth defects in surrounding villages. Many residents were never told why. Others only learned decades later that their illnesses were tied to the radioactive lake hidden in their backyard. For the Soviet government, Lake Karachay had become both a shield and a liability. It kept their waste contained, but it also stood as a monument to the dangers of unchecked nuclear ambition. Lake Karachay may be one of the most infamous nuclear waste sites, but it is not alone. Across the globe, other disasters tell the same story of secrecy and short-sightedness. In the United States, the Hanford site in Washington state once produced the plutonium for the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Today, it remains one of America's most contaminated nuclear facilities, leaking radioactive waste into surrounding soil and groundwater. Billions of dollars are still being spent to contain it. In Japan, the world watched in 2011 as the Fukushima Daiichi disaster unfolded. A massive earthquake and tsunami crippled the power plant, leading to meltdowns and radioactive leaks into the Pacific Ocean. Though very different in cause, it carried the same chilling lesson. Radiation respects no boundaries. And then, of course, there is Chernobyl. The 1986 meltdown in Ukraine created an exclusion zone of 1,000 square miles. Even today, nearly 4 decades later, radiation hotspots remain too dangerous for permanent settlement. Yet Lake Karachay stands apart. Unlike Chernobyl or Fukushima, there was no sudden explosion for the world to see. No images of burning reactors or collapsing towers. Its horror was quieter, slower. A lake that became deadly not in one night, but over decades of neglect. What makes Lake Karachay unique is its invisibility. To the eye, it looks like any other body of water, calm, reflective, even beautiful under the Ural sun. But beneath its surface, scientists estimate that more than 120 million curies of radioactive waste accumulated over time, a figure that made the lake per square meter more contaminated than even the grounds of Chernobyl. In fact, radiation levels were so intense that researchers once joked the lake wasn't just toxic, it was the place where Geiger counters go to die. Unlike Chernobyl, which drew international attention after its reactor explosion, Lake Karachay remained shrouded in secrecy until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Western scientists only began learning the full extent of its contamination in the 1990s, when declassified reports revealed the chilling numbers. By the 1990s, the Russian government faced a grim reality. Lake Karachay could not be allowed to exist in its natural form any longer. Each drought risked another radiation disaster, and the sediments at its bottom remained unimaginably dangerous. The solution was drastic. Engineers began filling the lake with concrete blocks, rocks, and industrial debris, effectively burying its waters under layers of stone. By 2015, the lake's surface had been completely covered. Today, Lake Karachay no longer exists as a visible body of water. On maps it remains, but on the ground it is nothing more than a graveyard of concrete hiding lethal waste. But burying the lake does not erase the problem. Radiation still lingers in the soil and groundwater around the Mayak facility. Villages nearby continue to report illnesses at rates far above national averages. For locals, the contamination is not history. It is daily life. Russia spends millions of rubles each year to contain the Mayak site, but the waste buried beneath Lake Karachay will remain hazardous for thousands of years. The half-life of cesium-137 alone is 30 years, meaning that even now only a fraction of the contamination has decayed. Strontium-90 and plutonium isotopes will outlast generations. Lake Karachay is more than a lake. It is a symbol of the cost of unchecked ambition, how the race for power can scar the earth in ways that no weapon ever could. Unlike Chernobyl, which erupted in a moment of crisis, Lake Karachay decayed quietly over decades. It shows how disasters are not always sudden explosions, but also the slow accumulation of choices, each one made in silence, until the damage is irreversible. It stands today as a warning. The water is gone, but the poison remains, buried under rock. And the land around it, once alive, still carries the shadow of radiation. You could walk past it now and never realize the danger beneath your feet. And perhaps that is the most haunting part. The deadliest lake on earth doesn't look like death at all. It looks like nothing. So what do you think? Should places like Lake Karachay be remembered as cautionary tales, or has the world already forgotten their lessons? Could humanity ever truly contain what it has unleashed? Or will these nuclear scars outlast us all?